How are you going to spend your time? How are you going to spend your life? It's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Spend time. What are you spending your time doing? Spend time. Your time is a resource. Your life is a resource. And the question is, how are you going to spend it? What are you going to do with your life? What are your goals for your life? What are you building? And do you have a plan to make it happen? I think if we're not careful readers of the Bible, we can have this idea that Jesus was a bit of a hippie. Just a few chapters ago in Luke's Gospel, Jesus said, don't be anxious. And we can kind of do this kind of thing where we kind of reduce that down to Jesus almost just saying, just chill, calm down. But not being anxious doesn't just mean just go with the flow. Not being anxious doesn't mean don't care. It doesn't mean don't have a plan. We may think that living for heaven means we have no plans in this world. But Jesus says otherwise in this next parable. Far from the chilled out Jesus who doesn't care, Jesus tells us that actually he wants us to care deeply, and he wants us to make plans for our future. This is the parable of the dishonest manager. And immediately it strikes us as a bit odd, doesn't it? In what way could this man ever possibly be an example? This accountant, this manager who was a cheat and a swindler. But the point that Jesus is making is, this man had a plan. He had a plan. Jesus doesn't praise the intentions of this man's plan, simply that he had one. And so Jesus' parable asks us to think, what are our plans? What are we going to do with the stuff that we have? What will people say about me at my funeral? What will my children say? My neighbours? My work colleagues? What is the impact of my life going to be? What am I going to do with the few short years that I have? How am I going to spend my life? Because as we've seen in the past 2 weeks in the parable of the prodigal son, we have been given life from God. We have an inheritance from our Father, our bios, our physical, material life. And the question is, what are we going to spend it on? The prodigal son, before he realized how bad it would turn out for him, spent it on wild living. He spent it on himself, on others, on parties. He wasted it. He had nothing to show for it. In fact, he spent it in such a way that not only did it cost him his bios, but it cost him his very being, his soul. Cost him to nearly lose his whole life had he not returned to the Father, to God. And so Jesus follows that parable with this one. How are we meant to spend our bios, our life? What are we supposed to do with the things that we have? What we will see in this parable is that, just as in the previous one, God is concerned with bringing people into his family, bringing people into the feast, into the life of heaven. And so that is where he wants us to invest our stuff. Let's have a little look at this parable. It's called the parable, I think in our version, in our Bible, it's called the dishonest manager, or sometimes called the shrewd manager, because he's praised for being shrewd. But what does shrewd mean? To be shrewd means to have sharp powers of judgment, to have presence of mind, to not be gullible, to see clearly and make good decisions. That is what has been commended by Jesus. And if we understand that, then actually the rest of the parable makes a lot more sense. Because this man was not good. He was not a good man. But he was clever. He was crafty even. And Jesus is saying we should be just as careful not to waste the opportunities given to us as this man was. So what happens in the story? Well, this chap, he was a manager, but he wasn't like an office manager. He was the manager of his master's estate. And so his job was to keep track of what was coming into the house and what was going out, what was being sold at markets, what was being bought, what animals were here, what animals were, what crops, all these things. But he's an employee. He's an employee, but he has quite a bit of responsibility and power. And the master, the owner, hears that this manager is cooking the books. He's skimming some off the top. He's embezzling. He's taking money for himself. He's up to no good. And so the master gives him his 2 weeks' notice. Says, right, mate, not having that around here. You're off. And so the manager, realizing that he's going to get fired, he says, I'm going to get fired. And when what I have done becomes public, no one is going to hire me. Who is going to want to hire a crooked manager to look after their stuff? And so he realizes he's in a desperate situation. He's backed into a corner and his life depends on him having a job and being able to provide for himself. And so what is he going to do? Well, he hatches a plan. Realizing how desperate his situation is and how little time he has to sort it out, he makes some bold moves to make sure that he will still have job opportunities even after he loses his job. He uses what is available to him to plan for his future. He thinks to himself, well, I've still got this clout for now. Nobody knows I've been fired yet. I can use my master's influence and my master's stuff to make friends for me now so that they will want to help me later. I mean, what's my master going to do? Fire me? He's like, there's no, this can't get any worse, so I'm going to use what I've got. So he calls on all the people who owe his master money or owes him resources, and he slashes their debts. What this tells us is that these people were in trouble too. They owed a lot of money, but now, thanks to the manager, they were now out of their sticky situation. And so how are they going to feel about him? They're going to be thankful. They might even say, I owe you one. And what happens is, when the master actually finds out what he's done, he's like, I'm not even mad. I'm kind of impressed. And instead of following through on firing him, instead he says, look, use that shrewdness for me and stay and work for me. And so the manager keeps his job and he's made good relationships with others. We've said before, haven't we, that a parable is a story with a meaning. So what's the meaning? What is Jesus' point? Is Jesus saying, be like this guy, be unjust, be ruthless, be a bit of a crook, put yourself at number one and everything will turn out right? No, he's not saying that, is he? Jesus has a very specific target in mind that he's aiming at with this story. And he makes it very clear for us in verse 9. He says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Jesus calls this wealth unrighteous wealth. He is saying gaining wealth this way is unrighteous. He's saying loving wealth is unrighteous. He's saying that most wealth generated by this world is unrighteous. But even this can be used for good. I think it's worth noting here as well that wealth isn't really the most helpful translation of this word. It's not bad, it's just not as helpful as it could be. In the parable, money is used as an example of wealth, but it's not the only thing in view here. The word that is used here is the word mammon. And if you've been around church for a while, you may know old translations of the Bible that talk about mammon. And it means it means more than money. It's more like the way that we used to use the word substance in English. So, if you were a person of substance, you were a person of good standing, of good breeding, you had weight behind you, had influence and probably wealth. Person of substance. So that's what it is to have mammon. Mammon. It includes the idea of wealth, but it also includes reputation, influence, skills, abilities, and all sorts of kind of physical and material goods of this world. All of your bios, all of your created life. And so one of the things that Jesus is teaching us in this parable is that just as the manager was not using his own money, in the same way our wealth, our mammon, isn't ours either. All the things that we have in this world don't really belong to us, right? We're just managers of them, stewards, we might say. We've been given them to look after for a little while, but then they will be somebody else's. Our physical goods, certainly, anyway. You could have them buried with you when you die, but you can't take them with you. They're not truly yours. So the things we have, the possessions we have in this world, don't really belong to us. They belong to somebody else. Ultimately, it all belongs to God. The bios we have is from God. And so the question is, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to spend it? Well, Jesus is telling us what we should be doing with it. Now let me say, if you're not a Christian, you don't really care about what Jesus says about how you should spend your stuff. But if we are Christians, then we care deeply about what Jesus says. And what he says is, we can't take a passive approach to our stuff. We can't just unthinkingly spend it wherever we want. We need to see that all of our life, all of our abilities, influence and wealth, including our money, has been given to us for a purpose. Jesus is telling us that what we have isn't ours, that he's tasked us with the management of it, and guess what? Jesus doesn't say its purpose is for you to enjoy it and use it on yourself. He says, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Jesus says, you have mammon, you have money and power and influence. I haven't given it to you for you to use on yourself. No, use it so that when you die and enter heaven, there will be a great welcome for you. Isn't that amazing? In other words, use what I have given you to see other people brought into the life of church, into the kingdom of heaven, so that there'll be a welcome for you. Because as we saw in our last parable, Jesus is all about people being welcomed into the life of heaven. I think this is wonderful. We sometimes struggle to know what to do with our money, what to do with our stuff. But Jesus tells us we can use our money, our time, and our skills and abilities to grow the kingdom of heaven and invest in our own eternal future. And so Jesus has 3 points in this parable. 1, this stuff isn't ours. 2, it's meant to be used to bring life to others. And so 3, his main point is, so be shrewd with it. Be shrewd. Look at the big picture and make a plan. Jesus says, if you were shrewd, you'd look at all the things you have and you'd say, what is the best way to use all of this? What's the best way to spend this for my future? If you were shrewd, you wouldn't waste it all here and now. You would have a plan for your future. It can be so easy to use our mammon unthinkingly. We can think, well, I've paid my bills, I've bought everything I need, all my fiscal responsibilities are dealt with, I've got some extra left over. And it burns a hole in our pocket And we kind of just spend it on the next thing that comes up. We buy treats and toys and unnecessary things. We spend our time, energy and money on things that don't last and don't matter. But Jesus reminds us that there is a future. There is a life, there is a reality beyond this one. And when we get there, we will look back on all of this very differently. In the resurrection, we will not care about what we achieved in our careers, or in sports, or in academia. We won't care that we had nice clothes and the good toys. We won't think, oh, do you know what? I wish I'd spent more time going out for drinks with the girls. I wish I made more time for sports. I wish I'd spent more time at the gym. I wish I spent more money on presents. We won't think, I wish I'd given more time to my hobbies and myself. I wish I'd treated myself more. In fact, we might even regret the little indulgent purchases, the coffees and the cakes and the nights out and the spa days, the manicures, takeaways and trips that we thoughtlessly bought and paid for. And we might think, I wish I'd invested in other people. I wish I'd invested more in church. I wish I'd been more generous. I wish I'd used what I had to show the love of Jesus to people. I wish I had participated in Jesus' generosity more, so that I could enjoy this eternal life even more. But Jesus is not simply calling us to be generous. He's calling us to be shrewd, wise in our generosity. It's not enough just to have an open hand with our stuff. It's not just about having a generous heart, willing to give whoever, whatever they want, whenever they ask for it. We need to ask, is this the thing I want to invest in? Is this investment going to be good for that person? Are we just giving stuff away thoughtlessly, or are we planning and working hard and being shrewd with what we have, so that we do actually have something in our hands to give when somebody who really needs it asks for it? Are we scheming to be useful for God? Are we plotting to help others? Because Jesus doesn't simply want us to be generous in any old way, the way that the world can be. Because we could say, well, I'm not attached to money. I don't love money. I spend it on people. I don't worry about tomorrow. If someone asks for money, no question asked, I give it to them. I'm always buying around at the pub. I'm always buying lots of presents for people. I'm always saying yes to people. I'm always going out with people and spending my time with people. This might be a kind of generosity, but it's not being shrewd. It's not being careful and having an aim and having a focus. Because it's all well and good splashing out on treats for people, but what happens when someone needs money for heating or food or clothes? It's one thing making time for your friends for social things, but are we free when someone just needs to come in and talk and be listened to? Do you have time when someone just needs a meal or a prayer or help with planning their lives? It's great to use your body to build relationships at the gym or the rugby club, but do you have energy to help someone move house or decorate or look after their kids or go to the hospital with them? And I think it's worth examining how often our generosity towards others actually overlaps with our own interests and hobbies. Jesus wants us to be shrewd. He wants us to see what we have and to think about how to use it in the grand scheme of eternity, and then be proactive, be wise, be savvy, scheming for the kingdom of heaven. Now, having said all that, there may be some of us thinking, how dare he? Yes, I might do X, Y, and Z, but I also ... Or, yes, I spend money in that way, but it's because ... And so let me say, there's two things I am not interested in this morning. The first one is being your judge. I'm not interested in that at all. If you feel a nerve has been touched this morning, I'm just going to say that's between you and God. I have no interest in making anyone feel guilty. The second thing I'm not interested in is trying to curate or make a list of things that you should and shouldn't spend your time, energy, and money on. I gave some general examples, which I think may be relevant to some of us. I know they're relevant to me. I gave some general examples so that we may examine ourselves. But the very last thing I want to do is give a list. You can spend your money on this, you mustn't spend your money on that. The last thing I want to do this morning is to say, you should never get a takeaway or a coffee or go to the gym, right? I'm not interested in that. That would be to completely miss the point. Because while it does matter what we do, how we spend our time and money, it can't be reduced down to a list of allowed actions. Life and faithfulness is much more complex than that. And that's what Jesus turns his attention to next as he addresses his audience as they process what they've just heard. When we read verses 14 to 18, it might kind of seem like a bit of a left turn, like, where's this gone? Why is he saying this? So let me just try and explain why Jesus talks to the Pharisees about the law and about divorce and that sort of stuff here. Basically, when Jesus told this parable, the Pharisees were listening, and the text tells us they loved their money, they loved their stuff. The Pharisees who were listening had a similar response to the one we might have just had listening. They felt got at. They felt criticised. And so, as many of us do when we feel criticised, they try and justify themselves. I do this and I do that. And that's exactly what they did, pointing out how actually they do the right things. They keep the law, and their record is above reproach. And in fact, Jesus, you can hear them saying, you're criticising us, but we're just keeping the law. So if you're criticising us, then you're criticising the law. And they're saying, see, look, this Jesus has come to rebel against God, to criticise the law. And so Jesus responds with a qualification, verse 16. He says, the law and the prophets were until John. By the way, that word until doesn't mean it stops afterwards, but we'll do that another time. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. Everyone comes into it by force, has to work into it. But it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Jesus acknowledges, he says, yes, the law and the prophets were right up until John. And now I am preaching the kingdom of heaven. Notice he doesn't say they're two different things. He's saying that's happened and this has happened. But it doesn't mean that we're getting rid of the law and the prophets. Don't twist what I'm saying, says Jesus. Jesus is not diminishing the law. He's criticizing the way the Pharisees used the law. Jesus is saying, don't misquote me. I'm not here to get rid of the law. I'm actually here to use it properly. I'm here to fulfill it, is what he says elsewhere. And so, this bit about divorce and remarriage is simply Jesus giving one example of a place where the Pharisees have reinterpreted the law for their own benefit. Because the Pharisees had developed this whole system, this whole kind of case law for how to get a divorce. They'd made up all these legal grounds for divorce. If this happened, you could divorce, and by the way, we'll get to it in a minute, but only men could divorce their wives. Wives should not divorce their men, their husbands, right? Messed up, right? They'd say, if this happens, you can divorce her. If she does this, you can legitimately divorce her. And they had all these laws that they made up, which effectively made it very easy for a man to divorce his wife for almost any reason. By doing this, what they had done was they'd taken a few words from Moses and extrapolated them out into this whole logical system of thought. They made up these rules and they told themselves, look, we've made these rules, they've kind of sprung from Moses, and as long as we follow these rules, then we're doing the right thing, and therefore we're still righteous. So the Jewish leaders had created a way for a man to divorce his wife just because he didn't want to be with her anymore, and then marry another woman and still claim to be righteous, still appear to be godly. They'd made up this whole system of law to justify themselves. But what does the law actually say about divorce? We can sum it up in 3 words. God says, God hates divorce. You can do it, but God doesn't like it. And so the Pharisees were trying to take something that God says he hates and then make out that they're righteous for doing it. That's what Jesus is addressing here. He's saying, just to be clear, when I criticize you, I'm criticizing you. I am not criticizing the law, because you don't follow God's law. You follow yourself. I want to say what's really, really important to remember here. This passage is not here to criticize divorced people. And Jesus is not trying to lay down a theology of divorce and remarriage here either. We can sometimes be guilty of doing what the Pharisees did. And we take a few verses, we take a few statements, and we build a whole logical argument about divorce and remarriage on those few things. Jesus isn't saying, he's hardly saying anything. He's certainly not saying everything that there is to say about divorce and remarriage. He's speaking to a particular group in a particular context, and he's using this issue of divorce and remarriage as an example of something the Pharisees were abusing. He's using it as a teaching point to address the hearts and minds of the people in front of him. And so we want to be very careful about coming to conclusions on divorce and remarriage from this text. This passage is not here to criticize divorced people. This passage is not here to say, if you're divorced and remarried, you're an adulterer. It's not saying that. It's not saying you're an adulterer, you're no good, you're a sinner, right? That's the opposite of what Jesus is doing. That's what the Pharisees were doing. The Pharisees were the ones going around with their little book of rules saying, you're a sinner, you're a sinner, you're a sinner. But that's not what Jesus is doing here. Jesus is not speaking to the person who's gone through a divorce. He's speaking very clearly to those people who would use divorce as a cover for adultery. Because notice, he doesn't say anything about the woman committing adultery in the remarriage. He said it's the man who's committing adultery. Because divorce and remarriage is not de facto adultery. But it could be if done for adulterous reasons. See how it's more complicated? Because we don't know the hearts of man. Only God does. Jesus takes aim at the man who is lusting after a woman who is not his wife, who then uses these rules to get rid of his wife so that he can have a new woman, and who wants to do all of this whilst upholding his righteousness. It's messed up. That's who Jesus is speaking to. And he's saying, you can do all the mental gymnastics you want. You can try and justify yourself and trick those around you, but you're not fooling God. He sees. He sees what you've done. He sees your heart, and he knows that it is full of adultery. Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, who are men And as men, they were the ones in the place of social power. They were the ones who could hand out a divorce to their wives for no reason and get away with it. But in our day and time, we need to apply these things more broadly. Because as women, and this is a good thing, as women in our culture have gained more rights and more self-determination, that also means they have more responsibility before God with how they use those freedoms and those rights. And this is part of what Jesus has been saying in this parable and throughout Luke's gospel. From him who much has been given, much will be required. The more you have, the more gifts you've been given, the more blessings you've been given, the more freedom you have, the more responsibility you have to use that in a positive way. As modern Britons, we have a lot of wealth. We have a lot of freedom and a lot of rights and a lot of privileges, more so than in almost any time in history, which is great. But we also have to remember that we're going to be held responsible for what we do with all of that. We have life almost too good, I would say. We don't realise how much we have. If nothing else, just take one example. We have more leisure time than any other people in history. For most of human history, people were farming from sun up to sunset, and they weren't even literate. They couldn't read. So they didn't have time to sit and read their Bible and pray and do all these things that we could be doing with our free time, instead of watching TV, playing video games, whatever it may be. We have so much time. We have more than enough money, most of us. We have a brain. We have creativity. We have abilities. What are we going to do with them? How are we going to spend our lives? What are we building? Don't waste your life on yourself. That would be a waste. Don't waste life pursuing pleasure and comfort and ease. Double down on Jesus. Spend your life pursuing him and his way, doing what he is doing, and have a plan. Be purposeful. The manager in the parable was in a bad situation, but he used what was available to him to not only get himself out of a bad situation, but to help the other people around him who were in a bad situation as well. That's us, by the way, and the people around us. All of us are born into a bad situation. We're born into death. We're born cut off from God. But there is one place to find life, in Jesus, in his body, in his church. And we would be fools if we didn't use everything we have to help other people come to him, and in so doing put all that we have in service of us staying in him. I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.